Good morning. I am Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this briefing this morning with the latest Understanding Scotland's Economy, the day after the Spring Statement yesterday. This session builds on our quarterly tracker published last week with the Diffley Partnership to ensure the everyday lives of people behind the economic headlines stay in front of everyone's minds. The results you heard last week were collected in the first week of February, and today we'll hear more data and reflections to help us understand even more. I'd like to thank the Royal Bank of Scotland for hosting us this morning and for the lovely breakfast. Before the main discussions gets underway, just to keep you all safe, I'd like to confirm there are no fire alarms planned this morning, so if the fire alarm goes off, please head to the nearest exit. We are recording the event, which is why the speakers have microphones. They do not work for amplification in the room, so if anyone is hard of hearing, please move close to the front. I have a whole front row that you've avoided very diligently. And now, I'd like to introduce the speakers. Dougie Robb is the CEO of Smart Data Foundry, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the University of Edinburgh, and it brings together financial services organisations, regulators, fintechs, researchers and government with a common goal: to use data in a safe way that people can trust to inspire new innovation and deliver economic, social and environmental benefits for everyone. They provide us with unprecedented insights into UK's economic health through secure access to de-identified banking data and finance data from millions of customers. By partnering with financial institutions such as Natwest Group and Virgin Money, they provide detailed evidence about financial behaviours, economic resilience and regional economic activity. And Dougie will be followed by Sebastian Burnside, who is the Chief Economist of the Natwest Group. Sebastian joined the Royal Bank of Scotland in 2009, and he's been Chief Economist for the Natwest Group since 2018. His area of interest include how society adapts to an ageing population, how the economics of the climate transition, the impact of technology and AI on jobs, and the shift to defined contribution pension schemes, and, if that's well enough, the microanalysis of customer transaction data. Before joining RBS, Sebastian worked as an economist for Ofcom and PwC, and he holds degrees in economics from the London School of Economics and the University of Edinburgh. And then Sebastian will be followed by Gary Gillespie, who's Chief Economic Advisor to the Scottish Government. Gary was appointed as Director to the Scottish Government, Gary was appointed in 2011 as the government's Chief Economic Advisor. He joined the civil service in 2000 from the Fraser Allender Institute, where his research interests included the Scottish economy, regional economic modelling and foreign direct investment. He provides advice to the First Minister and other ministers across a range of strategic and economic issues, and he publishes regular assessments of the state of the economy and the analysis of key impacts of things like EU exit, COVID, supply chain disruptions. So we've got all these big brains. I want you to make the most of them, but I also know we've got big brains in the audience. So I want me to use us all, and we'll have a great discussion after they've presented their reflections. So without further ado, over to Dougie.
Fair to say I've never been introduced as a big brain, so I think you've bigged me up there, Susan. So hopefully I don't disappoint. I'm Dougie Robb. I'm CEO of Smart Data Foundry. As Susan said, Smart Data Foundry we are owned by the University of Edinburgh, and we exist to partner with the likes of Natwest or RBS and other financial services firms and they very generously donate their data to us so that we can then go on to use that data for what we think is good reasons and for the right reasons. Now, what I mean by that? Well, really we're talking about things like socioeconomic reasons or reasons to help boost economic growth or areas of like economic inequality. So that sort of area. And who do we work with? Well, we typically look to work with the academic community throughout the UK, but also public sector, and that could be local government, it could be Scottish government, or indeed it could be departments of UK government. Now, we get the data in from the likes of Natwest, and what do we do with it? Well, we curate it to a larger or lesser extent. And I'll come on to talk about some examples of what that looks like. But I think the purpose of being here today is just talk a little bit about what the data that we get, what it tells us, and then how it sits alongside the latest outputs from the David Hume Institute. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do with the data that we get from Natwest. It's aggregate current account transaction data. Okay, now at a kind of and that comes in at quite a granular level. Okay, for almost 600,000 people in Scotland. And what do we do with that? Well, we curate that. We can curate that to quite a significant degree to create what is some aggregate output metrics. And 3 of these examples are here. The first one is overdrawn accounts. Now, this looks at the extent of, or the proportion of overdrawn accounts within a certain area or certain geography, and that can be down to like a neighbourhood level. Where we're talking about the instances of overdrawn accounts, we're talking about 2 instances of negative balances in any 1 month period. Then we talk about low emergency resilience. Now, when we talk about low emergency resilience, we're talking about instances in any given month where there's less than £100 in someone's bank account on 2 or more occasions. And the last measure that we have here is what we call living beyond means. Now, living beyond means is where an individual is spending more than 120% of their income in any given month. Now, it's interesting when you start to dig a little bit more into some of these metrics. So, and I think maybe just mention about some differences between what we find when we're looking at low emergency resilience and living beyond means. Living beyond means is we actually find prevalence of that within areas that are relatively more affluent. And the logic there is that in order to live beyond your means, you actually have to have the means to do so. So in actual fact, looking at something like low emergency resilience is perhaps a bit more insightful, but also there's more of a link between low emergency resilience and areas of where the more traditional areas of where there's maybe more long-standing poverty-related issues. Now, one other thing that we do track that's not on here, and I'll come on to that in a minute, or talk about it more in a minute, is we have a measure of average income. Now, traditional measures of average income would concentrate on salary, whereas what we've done, because we can see a bit more into what's happening in current accounts, we've got a measure of weekly average income, which includes benefits income and also pensions. And the latter might be quite important for some of the things that we're seeing. So what is this, digging into this a little bit more in terms of what it's starting to show us. So we've been tracking these metrics now for some time, and we've got a snapshot here going back for 12 months. The scale's a bit funny, but that's okay. Now, what you can see is the low emergency resilience. So this is where there's less than £100 in the bank account. That has declined a little bit over the course of the last year, but it's still kind of quite persistent around that 1/3 of the population mark. And then, actually, just one thing, just to go back a wee bit, the data here is as at the 25th of January, and it was released last week. So it's really very current, okay? So that just points to some of the value of the data that we get from Natwest. Now, as I say, so low emergency resilience, pretty consistent, declining a wee bit, but quite consistent around that 3rd level. Then overdrawn accounts, again, it's quite relatively consistent, declined ever so slightly, but the biggest difference that we're seeing is in that living beyond means. That's come down by about 1/3 over the course of the year. Now, and that's something that is, and that the trend around that low emergency resilience in particular is something that's consistent with, I suppose, that consistent pessimism that might be coming through from the DHI's Understanding Scotland report. Now, and again, if you dig a little bit deeper into that low emergency resilience, what you find is that it's particularly prevalent in the younger age group between 18 to 39, where it's actually over 50% of people are consistently experiencing that low emergency resilience. And then And there's a similar trend, actually, if you look into the incidence of overdrawn accounts. Again, it's elevated for that younger cohort. And this at a time where the younger people in particular are experiencing, increased financial pressures through, actually just through, increased unemployment in that age group. Now, so my next slide just starts to look at the comparison between what we're seeing and also what's coming out of Susan's work. Now, the Understanding Scotland report highlights that many people in Scotland don't actually feel that the economy is working for them. Now, there's a slight tension here between some of the things that we're seeing, which is an increase in this average weekly earnings. Now, the crucial point about the weekly earnings piece is it includes salary, pension, and benefits. And that's up 8% in the period that we're looking at. Now, and this is showing an increase in real incomes because the rate of inflation has come down nearly 1% to 3.2% in the same period. And yet, we have 62% of respondents to the DHI survey saying that they think the economic conditions are worse. Now, whilst our indicators that I showed don't actually show what people are spending money on, we can see that in lots of cases people are spending more than the income that they're generating or that they're receiving. Now, albeit that has dropped in the last from that 15% to 10%. Now, there may be something in there which is the increase in incomes is helping to support that that reduction in living beyond means. But it could also be a lack of confidence. Now, that maybe plays into the stat on the right-hand side there, which is that 52% of people are reducing their non-essential expenditure. So whilst maybe the data shows that people are better off, that's not necessarily translating into how people feel. Now, again, the data and the data that we see and the survey data does highlight this mismatch around perceptions and reality, and perhaps reality in the economy. Now, and that's mirrored in some of the official statistics coming out of ONS, where GDP is now, I think it's now 0.7% higher than it was at its previous peak, and it's now, but people are still reporting low satisfaction with their lives, and that's still below pre-pandemic levels. Okay, now it's all very well having all this data and intelligence, but what do we do with it? Now, what we like to do at Smart Data Foundry is actually to put this into the hands of, as I say, the researchers or the policymakers. And I've got a couple of examples that I'll just quickly talk about. One is a piece of work we're doing with Scottish Government. And this is taking the data, the current account data that we get from Natwest, and helping augment the Scottish Government's workforce or labour force statistics. The Scottish Government up until now have been reliant on the Office of National Statistics on their labour force survey. There are quite well known and well publicised issues with that around things like declining survey rates. So what we're looking to do is to give the Scottish Government a much more granular insight into what's happening on a much more timely basis within local labour markets throughout Scotland. So we're looking to show them people transitioning in and out of different stages of employment. So they might be employed, unemployed, economically active or economically inactive. And if we can give a much more up-to-date picture of what's happening at a local level to the Scottish Government, then the theory is that they can create much more timely policy interventions to help get more people back to work or move them from economically inactive to economically active and actually into employment. And that creates what is hopefully a great double win, which is more people in work and actually a lower benefits bill. So double whammy to the economy. Then another example of what we do is we like to work with local authorities. And we'll take some of the aggregate metrics that I showed you earlier on, and we will ingest data from the local authority. We can then work with different data combinations, and we put those data combinations in the hands of the people that work in the local authorities, and then they can then use those what we think are novel combinations to actually create those local interventions that work on the ground. And that has a benefit in as much benefit to the local council as well, not just to create those timely interventions, but actually it also helps break down perhaps silos within the local government, because you have departments that are working together. So that's it from me. As I say, we just like to get data into the hands of the people who can use it. And if anyone is interested in, or anyone got any questions, I'll be here at the end. And if you want to talk to us about what we can do, then happy to help with that. So over to Seb.
Thank you.
I think I'm supposed to.
Great. Good morning, welcome everybody. Sebastian, Burnside, Chief Economist for Royal Bank of Scotland. 3 parts to my brief reflections this morning. I'm going to kick off with a bit on how we think about and use the data that Dougie was talking you through in our partnership with the Smart Data Foundry, how that customer behaviour is showing up amongst our customers and what we can see from their financial behaviour, and then just to touch a little bit on particularly events of the last few days and how war in the Middle East might be influencing the outlook and what we're seeing from people's reactions to that so far. So on the data that Dougie just gave you a quick tour of, we believe this is very much the future of how we will do statistics and public policy analysis. It's not just an ONS or a UK problem with survey response rates. The same issue is affecting how we go about collecting information about what's going on in the economy in pretty much every country around the world. People just aren't replying to emails and surveys like they used to. And with the amount of data that all our activity is throwing off, we also feel that this allows far more a future where there is far more sophisticated, granular, and therefore helpful and accurate depictions of the economy and the society in which we're living in, if we're able to untap that. But a really critical component of that is trust, and that ultimately the people whose data this is, yours, have trust that this is being managed in a really responsible way, which is for the good of everyone in society, rather than for any one institution's private gain or what have you. So very early days in that process, but that's one of the reasons why we believe it's really important to try and share how this is being used for everyone's benefit at this stage. We saw some superficially, I'd say, Dougie, encouraging trajectories on some of those measures about fewer people spending beyond means and small reductions in the share of people with low emergency resilience. I think I'd give that a kind of 50-50 score on whether that's encouraging for 2026 or not, because it points to 2 slightly kind of associated observations we make from other data that we have. And that is the following. Number 1, it is still the case that if you were to run the kind of statistical rule book over the UK households and Scottish households' economic situation, you would find that people aren't spending as much as we would expect them to, given where unemployment is, higher than it was but not high, given where wage growth is, higher than it has been for a very long time, albeit lower than the recent very strong growth, and helpfully faster than most prices are going up. We still see, and particularly we hear from our corporate business customers, that consumers are exercising a high degree of value sensitivity. It is harder to part people from their cash, and they're making you work harder for it in terms of getting people across the line on that spending, that investment, that treat, or that whatever. So we are in a world where the household sector is saving a bit more than we would expect. There are positive sides to that, which is that from a financial stability perspective, we have very low levels of aggregate indebtedness. at this stage, which is big contrast to when we've gone into other global financial shocks in previous cases. So there's definitely some positive sides to that, but clearly, it's very hard to break out of the relatively low growth kind of mode in which the economy is in if people are keeping their belts tight, to use that kind of simile. And there is a sense, when you connect it to whether it's political polling or that sense of dissatisfaction that comes through from the Understanding Scotland survey, that this is also being influenced by the kind of mood music and the sentiment around, is the economy, is the country I live in working for me? Am I getting a fair deal? Do my children have the prospects that I felt I had when I was in that position previously? Not easy questions to kind of crack or to solve, but we definitely see that connected to the outcomes of relatively modest appetite for spending. But, and the innate optimist in me stresses this, but that means it is also easier to write an upside story here than it has been for many years previously, because you don't need an unsustainable borrowing binge in order to get growth going. You just need people to be a little less cautious than they currently are being, and you could see materially different growth in a very sustainable way. So, and the link, so that's kind of what I want to say on the savings point. How that shows up in savings accounts, however, I think is quite interesting. It has some connection into the emergency resilience side too, because we have had a big change in the savings landscape over the last 3 years, which is courtesy of the Bank of England. We as a financial institution have been able to offer savers something meaningful for the efforts of saving in an account. Interest rates which are sometimes higher than inflation, but certainly higher than the zero, which was largely on offer for much of the last decade. And it's been interesting to see the response to that. Obviously, people with substantial amounts of cash savings have always been pretty savvy about where they've moved that to move it around to make it work harder. But actually, some of the strongest balance growth we observe has been amongst accounts with relatively modest amounts in them. And actually the highest single growth rate that we've seen in our own customer base is amongst customers with less than £1,000 in either an instant access savings account or an ISA. So responding to the price signals that interest rates are offering, but probably more importantly, getting into the habit of saving. And maybe, just maybe, that little bit of extra wiggle room from wages beating prices on aggregate over the last 18 months or so has allowed a few more people than would otherwise have been the case to start that savings habit, which, as a bank, we feel is a really important way of getting you on the trajectory of building up that resilience and putting you in better stance in future. So, I'd say, cautious optimism on the kind of underlying trends that we're seeing from our customers' financial behaviour as to the possibility of providing more growth and more spending into the economy through the rest of this year. But, of course, that's all very influenced by the environment we find ourselves in, and certainly from a geopolitical and an international markets perspective, that's enormously affected in the last 2 days by the war in the Middle East centered around Iran. What do we know about that today? Well, clearly very early in a very sizable conflict. The primary focus with any conflict in that region is energy markets. We have seen reactions in those markets, relatively modest, I would say. Reactions in the oil market, so the price of barrel of oil has gone from roughly $65 a few weeks ago up to, I think it was 85 that we closed at yesterday. So significant, but not sort of unseen volatility in that market. The bigger impact is most likely to be coming through, particularly for European and UK and Scottish economies, through the gas markets, though. Because the Strait of Hormuz, this gap between Saudi Arabia and a variety of countries and Iran, is that key transit route which is currently shut. And we're seeing big producers, particularly of liquefied natural gas, like Qatar, start to shut down their facilities because they can't get their product out fast enough already. And that will be harder to resource and logistically route around than similar scale of interruption to the oil market. There are other sources of it. So the US is an exporter of liquefied natural gas, and some of our imports come that way. But the Middle East is still the biggest source, certainly for the European markets, and Asia, and which is also a big importer from the Middle East, will effectively be in a bit of a bidding war at the moment about where the destination of that very scarce supply ends up. So rather than the kind of $20 a barrel increase we've seen on the oil markets, we have seen a couple of days where wholesale gas markets for Europe have increased territory around sort of 40% each day, and looking forward to the next short-term contract. That is a very volatile market anyway. It's affected by weather, supply, all sorts of balancing factors, and this is only 2 days. So much depends on how and whether this is sustained going forward. From households' perspective, I'll start there first. The single most important channel is the Ofgem price cap on your gas and electricity bills. We have hopefully just had an announcement on what the cap for the next 6 months is. So it will, 3 months, sorry. So it will be, the observation window won't be opening for the next one for a little while. And any change, or the first change that households really feel as a result of what's going on today, if it is sustained, would be landing, I think it's halfway through June, but that sort of territory, much later into the year. So there is a bit of breathing space before any of those impacts were to land. But again, the big unknown is the intensity and the duration of the disruption in those markets and how that flows through. From a business and commercial enterprise side, the protections aren't there in the same way. So big energy users will already be trying to work out how they're going to navigate the increases in wholesale energy costs which are coming down the track to them. Many of them are very experienced and well practiced in that, but that won't make it any more of a less uncomfortable reality to try to replan their financials around that. So we would expect to see greater price pressure coming through there. And the combination of those two channels will also mean that probably the single most observable factor for people is the Bank of England is slightly less likely to cut rates either the next time they meet later in March, which the markets had briefly convinced themselves that there was going to be a cut then. We were never quite so sure, but I think much less likely now. Very unclear whether we will see further cuts through the rest of the year. At one point, markets had expected 2 cuts, but that balance is very much, or that judgment is very much in the balance as central banks around the world will be nervous of how hard it was to bring inflation down last time we got an energy price shock coming through. So I would expect a sort of more abundance of caution approach this time round, and certainly keen for them, or they will be keen to see greater evidence before continuing on any paths they went before. So I think where that leaves us is probably not seeing the interest rate cut as rapidly in the first half of this year as many people either would have expected or would be looking at pricing in the mortgage market that implied that expectation. with the rates that they were being offered. And finally, that kind of somewhat unquantifiable just sense of, gosh, it's quite an uncertain international world we live in. Many people will know someone who was or is or was about to be in that region at some point, given the level of travel and interconnectivity that we have these days. And so we'll have to see how that factor bleeds in and influences appetite and spending behaviour and potentially redirection of spend as well when it comes to the very specifics of holiday traffic and where people choose to go. So quite a lot of moving parts, a complicated picture as ever, but a moment of reassurance that we are, again, meeting this kind of volatility and uncertainty from a position of relative financial strength compared to previous episodes that we've been through. Hope that was helpful. Very happy to hand over to Gary. Thank you.
I'll come up as well and say hello. Morning, everyone. Lovely to be here. So I think the work that Dougie and the Data Foundry do is great. I think what we're really talking about, in a sense, is the difference between economic mood and economic fear. And economic mood's really positive for the economy. It can take a long time to build up, but when you have economic fear, it can transition really quickly into a downturn. So what we see in our own surveys, if I start with, we have a consumer sentiment indicator that we do each month, and we kind of do a direct method and an indirect method. And the indirect method tells us more about people's actual behaviour from what they actually do rather than what they actually fear. And sometimes there's a disconnect, and that disconnect is kind of, you have a fear about where the economy is going, but actually your own finances are okay, but you're worried because you know something else. So that disconnect is really quite important in that sense. And the other thing, so I'll maybe say a little bit about the macroeconomy in relation to what we've heard from Sebastian and Dougie, but I think the context of expectations, mood, confidence is really important for the economy. It's massive. Scotland's a small open economy, service sector is really important, consumption, household expenditure, and that belief and confidence to spend not beyond the immediate, but spending bigger purchases is really important. So that's the context. And the other bit that we've seen in previous kind of shocks, if you like, is what is important for you as an individual makes sense, but the aggregate economy doesn't. So you can deleverage, you say, oh, it's time for me to pull back. But when everybody does that, you end up with a kind of a downturn, a recession, and that's the kind of economic fear part. But let me say a little bit just about some of the context. So I would argue that we're in a slightly stronger position, that we've seen kind of economic fundamentals improving over the recent period, albeit we now kind of face another geopolitical kind of shock. But if you look at economic growth, for what it tells us and what it does tell us is it's a headline indicator. It's important to markets, it's the most reported metric, so people look at it and report on it. So the data for Scotland published just a couple of weeks ago, 2025, we've seen growth of 1.4%, so pretty low, but above the previous 2 years, about 1.1%. So still below the kind of trend growth rate, but coming back a little bit. The UK was 1.3%. We've seen the OBR forecast yesterday. Although they've changed the outlook for this year, downgrade the UK marginally, the overall growth pattern is much the same. It kind of catches up in the later periods. So you're seeing kind of slightly stronger growth, which is positive in that context. But then if you go to households and people in the economy, the labour market's a more important barometer. What's happening in your work, your pay, your conditions, the hours that you're getting. And in a sense, I think this is part of the story why we're seeing a kind of a stronger kind of upturn. The labour market still remains really resilient. It's obviously softened a bit last year. A slight falls in the number of people in employment. We measure that through the PAYE data, which is really timely up to January. But what we've seen is a kind of small decrease in the numbers of employment, but against a backdrop of unemployment, kind of circa 4%, employment rates nearly 75%. So you've got, basically, you've still got a relatively tight labour market with people, essentially businesses, still looking to attract people. So that's something that's really important, because if you're thinking about expenditure finances, how secure is my job? How good is the labour market in terms of that context and who's in employment? I mean, the data published, again, just the latest labour market data shows there's about 2.45 million people in Scotland in employment through PAYE, and that was up about 1,000 in December. So it's kind of gone up like that, come down a little bit, and it's starting to go back up. And over the year, it's down marginally, something like 0.2%. So that's kind of real income every week going into people's pockets, and that's really important. I think Dougie mentioned the kind of nominal pay growth, I think, of 8%. So if you go back to the Ukraine war and cost of living, with a massive inflation shock that we hadn't seen for a number of years, prices rising by kind of 20–25%. It's a massive shock, and particularly through the energy transition. So what that meant was real wages were negative. So people were basically, inflation was higher than your pay growth, and we had that for a sustained period. But we're now on the other side of that now. We've had 3 years where median earnings growth, albeit bar 1 month, has been positive. So you're starting to see the catch up in income. So people are not, you don't necessarily get back to exactly where you are, but you're starting to see that you're a little bit more disposable income. You're starting to feel your purchasing power coming back. And again, that takes longer, but we've had 3 years of that in the data, which is really important. And we see inflation at 3%, projected to reach its target later on in spring, and the expectations, obviously, again, caveated by possible changes, but again, I think that mood music's really important, as Sebastian mentioned, the kind of interest rates. What often happens as well is that people change very quickly. So you can have things going down, and then there's one change, and suddenly people's outlook change because they realise they're by the worst of it. And if an event's going to happen in 6 months, a year's time, often people's behaviour changes now. So you get these turning points that are really, really important for growth in the economy. So what does all of that mean? So basically all of that means is what you do day in, day out in the economy at the aggregate level matters. So confidence, expectations, mood, that feeling of stability that you've got around your pay, jobs, your outlook is really, really important for the economy. And getting back to the data point, having the real data of actually what's actually happening is so important, because you can get these disconnects about essentially what people are actually doing and what they feel or what they're saying. I think we're seeing, so on the consumer sentiment indicator, we're seeing kind of marginal improvements, albeit it's still negative. And we're seeing business confidence slightly more positive again in terms of that outlook. Sebastian's covered kind of external shocks, and there's a bit, so I won't go over that, albeit to say that we've had a number of shocks to the economy over a period of time. And I think the point is how resilient the economy is to shocks and how resilient people are. And if you think about the Ukraine shock, maybe caught people more off guard. So the impact of that energy price, the future rises coming, really impacted on people's kind of consumption behaviour almost immediately. So if you think about it, what Sebastian was describing, we're seeing people saving more, and they're saving more maybe out of caution, maybe to build their own resilience for future shocks. If you look back kind of this time coming up last year, we were dealing with the shocks of the tariffs and the kind of the month of April and what that did to kind of global markets and consumption. And what's interesting is that whole kind of change to the geopolitical kind of trade system is now priced in markets. So that bit has kind of happened, And I think similarly, we're seeing households, businesses starting to deal with a more uncertain world and looking at their supply chains, their resilience, and being able to kind of absorb that. All of that's just important because it feeds into your mood. If you can kind of see through the shock, if you think, well, actually this is a 3-month thing, it's going to come back. We don't necessarily need to panic. The worst thing is you get is everybody moving in the one direction at one time. It just becomes kind of self-fulfilling, so that's why. But I'm going to finish on an optimistic note. I think in a sense the fundamentals for the economy are improving. There's a kind of cyclical upturn that is kind of, it feels like me that's coming. And I think subject to kind of geopolitical events, then we can see a certainly kind of growth in the kind of trajectory that we've had in Scotland, certainly last year. And again, I look to pay, labour market, conditions, and the final thing is about what's actually happening across Scotland. There's a lot of positive news stories around investment in places, whether it's energy, digital, food and drink, services. So sometimes it's like you actually look about what's happening. Look what's happening in Edinburgh at the minute in terms of investment and stuff. So sometimes there's more of a story there that people don't realise, and sometimes the news that you get in the press can mitigate that. So I think I'm on the kind of glass half full side and more positive for the outlook. But I will stop there and let Susan do the questions. Thanks.
Can I just ask you, can I see where this is? Would that be all right? Just because of the camera. Fantastic. Just doing a little bit of logistics moving because of are you fine there for the camera, Alan? Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. What a whistle-stop tour of loads of really serious things we need to think about. I think the thing that we've got to remember with all numbers is a lot of the things we're talking about is averages. So from the Understanding Scotland tracker, we know there's roughly between a quarter and a third of people consistently struggling to make ends meet. So although generally we're seeing reserves in people's bank accounts going up slightly, that isn't for everyone. So I think we just need to sort of keep that in context, that we've still consistently got that. So we will hear lots through the election campaigns about how we might allocate resources in the future, but keep that 25% in your mind because they are really struggling. So that sense, the spring statement, we didn't really talk much about that, but I don't think there's really much to talk about, is there? It's kind of steady as you go, don't shock the horses, but oh my God, didn't we have a big shock of the horses at the weekend with war, although Sebastian used the word war, apparently on the radio on the way in I was listening, officially for insurance companies they're not classifying as a war, so you can't claim on your holiday insurance just yet. It's just a conflict, and so if you have tickets booked you can't get any money back. I'm lowering the tone slightly from the big heavy stuff. The thing that struck me was looking at the maps of where the boats are at the moment. So if you look at all the oil tankers, they're all avoiding travelling through a little bit of sea. That is really, really critically important. So the thing that we haven't mentioned is the price of shipping containers has risen dramatically over the last few days. So when I think about that, I think about, that kind of tells us something might be coming in terms of inflation. Or am I imagining that, Sebastian?
So price of shipping is really important. The flow through that particular bit of water is more energy than there are container ships that go through that, but it's mainly the energy bottleneck rather than the container ship one. We do see, and we have seen big moves in container shipping, but I think one thing to give you a little bit of comfort on is container shipping is so outrageously efficient that they put so much on these utter Goliaths of boats that you can have doublings, treblings, quadruplings of container shipping costs, and actually it's showing up as barely a rounding error to a penny on many of the things. Not all, but many of the things that you end up buying. You can put a lot of chips on a container ship and move them around the world without affecting the average price too much. So yeah, that would be of all the things I'm worried about. That wouldn't be the one which would make my worry list. But it does point to the broader point about the resilience to supply chains. And actually, there's a price of getting things, and even just can you get things? Was it Evergrande when we had the Suez Canal kind of blocked briefly? Yeah, suddenly you had to know which container ship your shipment was on. Was going to be critical as to whether you knew you could fulfill your customer's order or not in the next few weeks. And being, I think, particularly businesses being more attuned to those kind of obstacles is critically important if you're going to be able to do what you promised to your customers.
So you mentioned the worry list. What is on your worry list?
You really want to plumb the depths this morning, the worry stuff. But I think so. We clearly live in times when there are big changes geopolitically to how countries are trading and interacting with each other. And that poses massive challenges to people trying to take long-term decisions, whether that's long-term decisions on where to invest, who to strike up supply arrangements with, who to partner with for potential markets, or individuals' decisions about where is the best place, to send your kids to university around the world, or to start a business, or to relocate yourself. And I think, that feels like the big change in the last year versus, perhaps the previous 20 or 30 where the trajectory was generally to more open, more globalization. Globalization isn't quite as dead as some people would have it. World trade rose last year despite all these tariffs, which is, didn't rise by very much, but it did, right? So we're not shrinking, back to our own borders, but we are seeing a fragmentation in those alliances, which is much, much more complicated to navigate. And that definitely comes with costs, and it definitely for our, particularly for our political leaders, we see on a daily basis how challenging it is to steer that tightrope and be friends with who you need to be friends with, and keep your principles and position your country best for your residents and your society. So super challenging dealing with all that.
I can see Gary looking. Do you want to share your worry list, or shall I go to the audience?
Worry list is a good question. I think just to add to what Sebastian said, obviously the Suez Canal, this is partly a logistic shock as well. So if you block a transition route, and what we've seen there was essentially containers still get through, but it took 2 weeks longer coming east to west. So that was a readjustment, and people were concerned about where things were. That obviously adds to cost because more fuel costs and time. But so a lot of this is about how resilient supply chains are and how close. And I think supply chains have changed quite a bit from the early days of COVID and disruptions from China, to EU exit, and people kind of being aware of how resilient they are to kind of disruption. So I think that has really changed. I think on the worry list, I think I would just reflect that we've had a series of kind of shocks over the last, if you go back from the financial crisis through COVID, inflation, with changes in how we trade through EU exit, oil price shock of 2014 was important, had a big impact in Scotland as well. So we've had a series of shocks, and it would be nice to have a kind of period of stability where people could actually be quite confident of an outlook beyond 2 or 3 years. And I think to me that would be really, I think that's essentially the missing ingredient in terms of the kind of growth, investment, productivity stuff coming back, because essentially, I was talking about economic fundamentals. Competitiveness of the economy relates to essentially how you function across a range of areas. And I think if we could get more of a focus on that and less than having to respond to geopolitical or macro events, then that would really improve the mood of the economy. So more stability, I think, As I said, there's loads of positive stuff going on. We can talk positive stories around a number of sectors of the economy, and I think that could be accelerated, that mood music, if there was just a little bit more stability. Energy markets are important globally for businesses, for households, important for Scotland as well. What happens in terms of energy prices relative to investments in renewables or different forms of energy. So kind of stability is what I would ask for, really. I think that's the key thing. And with stability, you get confidence. And with confidence, you get a more positive outlook. For businesses, that's investment. For households, that can be consumption, purchases, or savings. So I think that would be important.
Fantastic. There's a quote from 2,500 years ago. I think it was an ancient Greek called Heraclitus, if I've got that right. You know, ancient people are in the room. I think he said change is the only constant in life. So perhaps we can have some stability, but as long as we can all cope with the change. Dougie, you also analyse data of business bank accounts through Sage. And some of the small business data in there is really interesting. Are you able to share any insights from that about what businesses are thinking and feeling?
So, as well as having the partnership with Natwest, we also partner with Sage, and every quarter they share with us accounting transaction data from a number of small businesses across the UK. And what we're able to see with that is the relative performance of different sectors and different businesses across different parts of the country. And then similarly, we've also recently started doing a monthly payroll tracker or workforce tracker, because Sage as well as providing that accounting software to businesses, they also provide payroll services for companies across the UK. And I think generally what we're seeing through that is probably mirrored in a lot of the themes that we've talked about this morning. There is a kind of a modest uptick across things like wage growth. There's some improvements, some modest improvements in productivity. Now, when we talk about business productivity, it's within the context of the work we do with Sage. What we're talking about is changes in real output per employee. Now, there's also some interesting regional things coming out. And one of them for me is actually the extent to which parts of the country are improving faster than the traditional hub in and around the southeast and in London. And Scotland's no exception to that. So that's really interesting. And I think a final reflection might be just listening to or reflecting on the comments from Gary and Seb, is it does strike me that right at the very top, we have what is hugely uncertain and unstable, and it changes from day to day, week to week, what's happening at a sort of that highest geopolitical level. And that might be the cause of that disconnect in some of the numbers that we're seeing between people maybe on paper are slightly better off, but that's not translating through to confidence. And it just strikes me it's potentially because of that extreme geopolitical uncertainty that's just filtering down. We just don't know where we're going to be next week, frankly. That's
right. To the audience, who wants to start us off? Chris.
Chris Carr, University of Edinburgh Business School. It's obviously really helpful. Thank you for the short-term one-year data. And last week, Scott's data was really also very, very helpful. But I can't help thinking on the disconnect problem that the problem is really a decade-type level of analysis. I mean, we had Denton last week. Compared with 10 years ago, we now have 75% not voting for either Labour or Conservatives. That's a sea change. But it's the same disillusionment a little bit with the SNP and disillusionment with government. So I kind of feel that that's quite important. And at the same time, the fundamentals of the real economy compared with a decade ago, are not strong in Scotland. You know, you're way behind Southern Ireland in terms of prospects, and people are feeling that. And there's massive outgoing investment. I mean, in the big wealth-creating industries, you know, pharmaceuticals, oil and gas, AI today, all the big multinationals are pulling out of investment. And so that foreign direct investment in a global world seems to be hitting the global economy quite heavily. And then there's the geopoliticals obviously feeling a bit insecure right now, quite rightly. One day we have America right behind Europe. Now we have a war in Ukraine, and America's going a wee bit AWOL around the world, and it looks pretty unstable. So maybe a decade perspective might be really helpful, having short-term data too, I agree.
So, I was talking to my wife about this. You know, for most of my adult life, it's that the world has been remarkably stable. But you know, since 2007, it's changed, and that's difficult to adjust to. So I would agree.
Yeah, and if I can add, so we do look through we do look over time at averages, what's happening, and the different kind of periods. I think I was reflecting more on the current data because I think that's more important for mood and outlook. But as Dougie said, with a period from about 1992 to 2007 where there was just constant growth in the UK economy, and it was called the nice period by the Bank of England because basically you had constant growth without inflation. And for that period, economic mood was really strong with all of the with strong revenues. And then you have the financial crisis, which obviously is a massive shock. And then following that was a period of kind of austerity. And then you go into kind of EU exit, which is 2016 coming up, that vote, that then impacts expectations. Then you go into a kind of a pandemic shock, which was massive in terms of how we live and work and the kind of recovery from that. And then you come out of that into an inflation shock that was coming partly through the recovery from pandemic and then into Ukraine and stuff. So, but what the numbers tell you over that period is since the financial crisis in particular, productivity in the UK has fallen. So with productivity disconnect, UK productivity is something like 0.4% per year on average from 2008 to 24. It's 0.8 in Scotland, but the fall in Scotland was from a kind of a lower base. So the kind of period-long changes are reflected in the data, and people feel the mood of the last kind of 10 years, feel what it's been like in terms of pay shocks, households, uncertainty. So that mood takes a long time to change. That's why I was kind of arguing you need a kind of period of stability. The economy almost needs to get boring again, so people moan about other things, and that's almost that's what you almost need, kind of thing, to do that. But I don't know if you get a view.
Sorry, I echo the productivity point. The stat, which Scott can correct me if I'm wrong on, is at the last general election we had 40% of voters changing their vote from the previous election, and that's the highest it's been at a UK level in a century. That's my interpretation of the societal reaction to the decade and a half of lost productivity growth, lost rising living standards. That doesn't make it easy for any political masses, but if people feel dissatisfaction about how things are playing out for them, then they're going to start shopping around. And I think that redoubles the importance of getting growth going that works for as many people as it can.
Scott, can I bring you on trust? Would that be all right if you say a quick thing about that? Because I think that's a factor in some of these.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of just building on all the points everyone's been saying, we do see quite low levels of political trust amongst people, high levels of disaffection, and equally in the data that we published last week, very few people feeling that the economy works for them. But I think on kind of Chris's point about the kind of longer term, even if we go back 3 years on the tracker, we were at kind of 90% of people thinking general economic conditions were worse. So if we're sitting at 6 and 10, we're saying not great, still very pessimistic, but it's certainly movement in the sort of like right direction, if you will. And then in addition to that point, and I think this comes to the kind of point about confidence and what people might want to do and trust, people don't trust that when a shock happens that they're going to be shielded from it, or even if they have the financial resilience on paper, they don't feel it. So if you look at the last shock, yeah, there was kind of changes in terms of utility bills and housing costs and things like that. If we look at the tracker this time, people tell us the things they expect to spend the most money on the next year remain more money on utility bills, more money on housing costs, more money on food and drink, i.e. unavoidable costs that they feel like they're just going to spend more on. And my kind of last point on that would be, if you take the personal to the general, as a kind of rule of thumb in social research, everyone, when they bring things closer to them, feel a bit better. So around 4 in 10 might think that their personal circumstances are going to get worse in the next year. It's really easy to focus on that worse, but that means a majority think it's either going to be about the same or better next year in their own personal circumstances. So I think it's about how do you then change that into understanding resilience that some people have, to kind of take your point, and then how do you then transfer that into the spending on some of that more, we might call it discretionary, but it is the stuff that actually drives the growth and things that people were talking about. So I suppose the question, if there was a question for the panel, is then how do you then unlock that and transfer into that confidence?
Hi there, it's Alistair Grant from the Scotsman. Just looking ahead to potential issues, I wanted to ask, perhaps particularly Gary, about the kind of issue around the rising social security bill. There's lots of political debate about this potential black hole coming in Scotland, about the amount we're spending on benefits. And I was quite struck by comments by the Scottish Fiscal Commission recently that by the end of the next parliamentary term, more than 1 million Scots will be on disability benefits. I just wondered if you saw that as a problem, as something that needs to be addressed.
I suppose the context for this is devolved social security payments in Scotland and the difference between the additional benefits that you receive in Scotland. There's kind of 5 benefits. The main benefit is the Scottish Child Payment, which is paid to families below the poverty threshold. And I think, so in answer to your question is, in a sense, I don't really see it as a kind of fiscal hole, because the way the Scottish Parliament works and the way the fiscal framework works is, in a sense, you have to balance each year. And I think if you look at the social security payments in particular, they're targeted at the reduction in child poverty and the kind of statutory targets around that reduction. And if you think about social security payments as well, and what Susan's talking about, kind of the difference between averages and people experiencing kind of in-work poverty, and the difference kind of cash in person makes. So there's an argument probably for Scotland in the sense that in times of kind of times of shock, that actually having a slightly bigger welfare or public sector actually provides a bit more resilience to households and individuals. I think ultimately you kind of want more people in employment, you want people paying more tax, and you want people able to kind of progress. But I think the safety net, if you put it in that context, I don't think it's necessarily a drag. I think you see it in other contexts. We haven't seen data that it's having a negative impact on people's employment perceptions, and the government will publish a child poverty plan this side of the election, which will kind of set out the trajectory for that. And I think the benefit part of that's a key part of that.
Just to add the context, I was at an event last night looking at the link between inequality and the economy. We've got to remember 40% of people on universal credit are in work, so they're not earning enough to live on. So one question that's come up before, we haven't got an answer to it, but at the moment DWP work coaches coach people into any job. And the question posed to me, and I can't answer it yet, but I want to think about it, is it a misuse of public funds to coach someone into a job that doesn't pay them enough to live on? You know, should we concentrate on coaching people into jobs that are fair work rather than just any job, a precarious, perhaps 0 hours contract that is going to add more stress to their life? I I think the other thing to think about in terms of the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts is they're calculated on the current disease burden. I say burden because that's what's going to cost our society, is how many people are getting diseases. Now, if you have got the Scottish Child Payment intervening in households and reducing the level of cortisol, which is directly linked to diseases such as heart disease and cancer, cortisol in that household, so that whole family goes down, that means our disease burden is going to be reduced. So we have to talk about that as an investment in order, like preventative spend, to reduce what's coming down the line. The other factor, I think, in terms of Scottish Fiscal Commission forecast I'm fascinated by at the moment is they can only forecast for changes that relate to things the Scottish Government are spending money on. So external of that at the moment, from basket analysis, which is Cantor, or now the rebranded Numerator, they are seeing basket changes that show roughly 10 to 15% of the Scottish population is on weight loss drugs. So that disease burden in those people is going to change dramatically, perhaps if they're no longer getting diabetes or heart disease. Is there going to be another replacement disease that they get as a result of taking those drugs? We don't yet know. But at the moment, the forecasts are on the current obesity rates. But we can see the trends already showing they're changing. If Greggs are changing their menu, we know that things are massively happening in the retail market that we're not yet seeing in the numbers. And I think we just need to be aware how quickly people's lifestyles are changing at the moment, and we're not picking them up in the long-term forecasts. So remember, forecasts are a best guess, but we do know growing up in a household that cannot put food on the table or heat their home or has black mold growing is going to massively affect the amount of money the state has to spend on you, whether or not that's through health things or ending up in the prison service. So we need to remember that as context. Sorry for being depressing, but I've got a journalist, so I always like to make sure that we look widely at the really complex nature that is our economy. And although benefits by some are considered a burden, they're also going to be an investment in actually changing how our economy works, because we need people to be healthy and in the workforce. I can see someone wave at me.
Just a quick comment, addition to your... I think Scotland is also unique in a way that it promotes a Fair Work Framework policy initiative, which is kind of initiative to support people with disabilities and single parents and people who require flexible working commitments into employment, which is, I think, in addition to, you can work on the Fair Work Framework Policy Initiative whilst you are on benefits, on disability benefits. So this is a unique policy which is not evaluated yet. So the effect of the policy is quite, it's hard to measure at the moment because it's quite new. But I think Scotland is unique in that way.
Hi, it's Andrea from Bigger Economics. Thank you very much for all your interventions. I guess my question was around, it was interesting to hear about the fact that basically bad news means a change straight afterwards, and good news in the economy takes time to filter in and change behaviors by consumers and businesses. And also you talked about sort of those shocks through COVID and sort of the inflation linked to the Ukraine war, and how that sort of then led to changes in businesses in terms of their own supply chains and households, as we're seeing, I guess, in some of the data around higher levels of savings that we are seeing. And I guess you mentioned the importance, Gary, of like stability and creating a framework whereby people feel free to spend more in the economy and support consumption. I guess what does that stability look like when it comes to government policy? What can government do to support a more stable environment and bring the good economic news into the actual reality of people spending?
Go. I'll leave it to you to decide who answers that. Thanks. Yes.
Yeah. So I suppose what does stability look like in terms of government policy? Probably not having to mitigate against shocks, and actually being able to look towards kind of supporting positive investment and structural change. So I think that would be the context of what would be. I mean, economic strategy is usually about long-term change and kind of thinking about what the drivers of growth are, whether that's enterprises, innovation, competition, infrastructure, investment, and a lot of the key things that essentially drive your underlying competitiveness. So if you could have a period where you're kind of debating about different investment options rather than maybe having to invest to kind of mitigate the impacts of shocks, whether it's energy, plants closing or different changes, then I think that would feel... So there's always a tension between short and long term. And ultimately, it's the longer term drivers that are really, really key for the economy.
Thank you. David Iser from Consumer Scotland. I had a question about the bank account data and potential future uses of it. I think that data is clearly incredibly useful at sort of painting a picture of consumer behaviour and financial resilience. As I say, my question is sort of about the future potential uses and sort of relates to some of the things that Susan was saying. I think one of the things we know from recent macroeconomic crises is that it's very difficult for governments to target support at households who really need that, whether that's sort of energy bill support or cost of living support more generally. Do you ever see a point in the future where this type of bank account data could be used as part of that targeting mechanism? You know, potentially, I mean, I guess you might need it to be some sort of opt-in policy. You might need some sort of independent third party to manage some of that data. Do you see that as potentially something that we could be using this data for in future, or do you just think, you know, given data protection issues, trust issues, we just sort of need to forget about that potential?
So what I'd say on that is, and actually, I'll maybe give a few examples. So, sorry, I forget your name, sorry.
This is Alistair.
Alistair, you asked about your question was answered by Gary in the context of Scottish Child Payment. Now, one future use, we have a research application at the moment which wants to almost assess the impact of that additional Scottish Child Payment. Okay, so that's because you actually have a control group, because our data the data that we get from Natwest covers the UK. You have the control group of Scotland and the rest of the UK. So that's one example of the type of work that we could do. Now you talk, and in the context of how far can you push the use of the data? Well, one thing that we've recently started is a series of public engagement. So we're creating our own public panel. So we will take those types of questions to that panel to get their view as a way of canvassing the views of the public, because that trust piece is really important. And because we are really aware that what we do is we're quite privileged to do what we do, and there's a lot of trust put in us, not least by our data partners. So we're not looking to actually what's happening on an individual level. So we will never work with cohorts of less than 10 because we don't want to be able to re-identify people. But we can work in quite small geographic areas. So in order to maybe be a bit more, offer more sort of direct or targeted support, you might zero in on geographies rather than individuals. Okay, and we're talking about geographies of, or as I say, cohorts of less than 10. But actually, what we'd love to do is actually take it a bit of a step further than that, and actually move into, and I was talking about, some of the work we do with local authorities, where they will share some of their data with us. What we'd love to do is, through some of those data combinations, is actually move into the world of things like predictive analytics. So you're actually able to think, to start creating scenarios where you think, actually, the probability of something happening here on this basis is actually, so you can start to articulate that. So you can then, and our chair would talk about it as, instead of looking through the rear view mirror, you're actually looking through the windscreen. So that's kind of where we want to push it. But to do that, we need to take people with us, and that's where that public trust piece comes in. That's where the public engagement piece comes in.
Yeah, maybe just add a point. I think the example around the evaluation evidence is great because you've got an actual counterfactual for bank accounts, and you can see the impact of that, whether it's the kind of resilience measures you were talking about and where that money actually goes. So that is really important. If you think about how quickly sometimes the government has to respond to shocks as well. So if you think back to COVID, the furlough scheme, how that had to be administered essentially through HMRC really, because they had the data. So I think having other data sources would be really helpful, because it was more difficult to get that support to self-employed that didn't have accounts, say, for 2 years, weren't registered. So having actual real data that's verifiable and can be usable in a trusted and non-disclosive way, I think is really important.
Sebastian, last thoughts?
Well covered.
Fantastic. So sadly, it's down to me to bring this in on time and release you all to the rest of your days so you can be productive, as we've been talking about productivity. There's so much to take away from today's discussion, and I really thank you all for sharing your thoughts. Thank you also to all the panellists, Dougie, Gary and Seb. I think there's so much food for thought that we really need to go away and mull over and then think about what we do next with it. I'm fascinated by the gap between what people do and what people say and then what that means. But I like that analogy of aiming to look through the windscreen instead of the rear view mirror. So I will file that away, Dougie, and probably quote you lots as I... So for those of you that haven't been to a David Hume Institute event before, please remember we're a charity and we can only continue bring you free events as a result of donations. Today we were lucky to be hosted by the Royal Bank of Scotland and Natwest, so thank you very much, and thank you for the lovely breakfast. So all that's left for me now is to say thank you to the speakers, thank you to our online audience as well. I enjoy the space for a little bit longer. We can have an informal discussion for the next half an hour or so for those that want to. Thank you very much.